I had been on the road for 13 hours when I finally walked into that hospital carrying the kind of hope a man only gets once in a lifetime. My grandson had been born. In the back of my SUV was a wooden cradle my late wife had saved for nearly 4 decades, the same cradle our son had slept in as a baby. I had spent weeks sanding it smooth, repairing every loose joint, imagining the day I would place another generation inside it. But I never got the chance. My daughter-in-law looked straight past me and turned to the nurse. "Why is he here? Only real family stays." I waited for my son to say something, anything. Instead, he lowered his eyes. "Dad, just give us some space." Her parents stayed. Her sister stayed. He left. And because I was too tired to drive another 13 hours, I spent that night alone in a motel less than 10 miles from my grandson, hoping my son would call and tell me to come back. He never did. 4 days later, my phone rang. It was the hospital billing office. "Mr. Dawson, we're ready to process the $6,800 payment you authorized." That call changed everything, because once I stopped asking why my daughter-in-law wanted me gone, I started asking a much more dangerous question. What had my son been telling everyone about me? The answer would uncover a $50,000 lie, a secret from his marriage, and a truth about that baby none of us were prepared for. But the biggest betrayal wasn't the one I expected. And this time, I wasn't going to clean up my son's mess for him. My name is Raymond Dawson, though most people have called me Ray since I was young. I was 67 years old, a retired municipal electrical supervisor from outside Lexington, Kentucky, and a widower of 4 years. After nearly 4 decades spent fixing systems, managing crews, and making sure other people got home safely, I had discovered retirement was much quieter than I expected, especially after losing my wife, Pat. Nathan was our only child. When he called to tell me Rachel's induction had been scheduled, I wrote the date on the kitchen calendar, even though I already knew I wouldn't forget it. "Dad, come down," he told me. "I want you here." I asked him twice whether he was sure. It was a long drive to Tampa Bay, and the last thing I wanted was to become one more responsibility while Rachel was preparing to give birth. "I'm sure," Nathan said. "Just text me when you leave." That was good enough for me. I was on the road before sunrise. The cradle was secured behind me beneath 2 moving blankets and a canvas strap. Nathan had slept in it as a baby. Pat had refused to throw it away when he outgrew it. One day, she used to say, "We might need it again." For years it sat in the back of our garage gathering dust. After Pat died, I almost gave it away. Then Nathan called one Sunday evening and told me Rachel was pregnant. I spent the next several weeks restoring it. I replaced 2 damaged slats, tightened the old joints, sanded away decades of scratches, and applied a fresh finish that left the wood warm instead of shiny. I even found one tiny mark beneath the frame where Pat had written Nathan's initials in pencil when he was an infant. I left it there. Some things shouldn't be repaired out of existence. Nathan checked on me several times during the drive. At a gas station in Tennessee, I found a message waiting. "Drive safe, Dad." A few hours later, "How far out are you?" Then, when I was less than 2 hours away, "She's doing okay. Baby's here, both healthy." I pulled into the next rest area and sat behind the wheel for a moment. A grandson, Miles. I said his name aloud just to hear what it sounded like. "Welcome to the world, Miles." For the first time in months, I wished Pat had been sitting beside me so badly it physically hurt. She would have cried. Then she would have laughed at herself for crying. I arrived at the hospital tired enough that my knees complained when I got out of the SUV, but I barely noticed. Nathan had texted me the floor. By the time I reached the postpartum unit, I had rehearsed exactly what I was going to do. I would congratulate Rachel. I would tell Nathan I was proud of him. I would stay 10 minutes if that was all they wanted. No advice, no question, no stories about how things had been done 37 years earlier. Pat had accused me more than once of turning every family moment into a briefing. "Sometimes Nathan needs a father," she used to tell me, "not a foreman." I was determined to remember that. When I reached the room, Rachel's father, Frank, was standing near the door with 2 cups of coffee. Her mother, Janet, was inside near the window. Rachel's younger sister sat in a chair with a gift bag at her feet. Frank looked surprised to see me. "Ray." "Frank." We shook hands. "Long drive?" "Long enough." He gave a small laugh and stepped aside. That was when Rachel saw me. She was sitting upright in the hospital bed with Miles bundled against her. She looked exhausted, pale, and understandably overwhelmed. For half a second, I thought she might smile. Instead, her expression tightened. She looked past me toward the nurse who was checking something near the wall. "Why is he here?" The room went strangely still. I thought I had misheard her. The nurse glanced at Rachel, then at me. Rachel adjusted the blanket around Miles. "Only real family stays." I felt those words somewhere beneath my ribs, not because Rachel wanted privacy. She had every right to decide who came into her hospital room, but her parents were there. Her sister was there, and I had just driven 13 hours because my son had personally asked me to come. I looked at Nathan. He was standing near the foot of the bed. For a moment, our eyes met. I gave him every opportunity to explain. Maybe Rachel had changed her mind. Maybe something had happened during the delivery. Maybe she needed immediate family from her side around her. Anything would have been better than silence. Nathan looked away. "Dad," he said quietly, "just give us some space." I stared at him. "You want me to leave?" He rubbed the back of his neck. "Just for now." There was something about those 3 words that hurt worse than if he had simply said yes. "Just for now," implied later. "Just for now, let everyone pretend this wasn't really rejection." I looked once at the baby in Rachel's arms. Miles had a small round face, reddish cheeks, and dark hair pressed flat against his head. "He's beautiful," I said. Nathan nodded. I almost told him the baby's chin reminded me of Pat. The words slipped out before I could stop them. "He's got your mother's chin." Nathan's head came up. "Dad, he was born a few hours ago. Nobody can tell who he looks like yet." The sharpness surprised me. "I suppose you're right." Rachel looked down at the baby. I stepped backward. "I'll let you all rest." Janet started to say something, but I didn't give her the chance to make the moment easier than it was. I walked back through the hallway, rode the elevator alone, and crossed the parking garage toward my SUV. The cradle was still in the back. For a few seconds, I stood there with my hand on the rear door. Then I locked the vehicle and walked away. I was too tired to make the return drive safely, so I checked into a motel less than 10 miles from the hospital. That night, I sat on the edge of the bed watching headlights move across the curtains. I kept expecting my phone to ring. It didn't. Early the next morning, I sent Nathan one message. "Still in town until 10. If Rachel feels up to it, I'd love 5 minutes with Miles before I head home." I waited. 9 o'clock came, then 9:30. At 10, there was still no answer. So I carried my bag back to the SUV, looked once at the cradle beneath the blankets, and began the long drive north. 4 days later, the hospital called me, and suddenly everyone remembered I was family. The call came just after lunch, while I was standing at my kitchen counter sorting through the mail I had ignored since coming home from Florida. I almost let it go to voicemail because I didn't recognize the number, but something made me answer. "Mr. Dawson?" "Yes. This is Melissa from the hospital billing office in Tampa. I'm calling regarding the payment arrangement you authorized toward Rachel Dawson's patient responsibility." For a second, I simply stood there with an unopened electric bill in my hand. Then she said the amount, $6,800. I remembered agreeing to it months earlier. Nathan had called after they received an estimate of what insurance might leave them responsible for. He had sounded embarrassed, asking whether I could help. I told him I could cover part of it. Rachel later signed whatever permission the billing office needed to discuss that specific contribution with me, and I provided the payment information. At the time, it had felt simple. My son was having a baby. I could help. Now the same promise felt different, and I hated that it did. The woman on the phone was polite. "We're ready to process the payment method we have on file. I just need your confirmation." I looked through the kitchen window at the driveway. My SUV was parked where I had left it, and the cradle was still inside under those moving blankets. "I need a little time," I said. "Of course. Don't process anything yet." She confirmed that nothing would be charged without my approval and gave me a number to call back. After I hung up, I sat at the kitchen table. My first instinct was to cancel it. My second was to feel ashamed for having that instinct. Pat would have understood the difference between those two reactions. She had always been better than I was at separating hurt feelings from decisions. I picked up my phone and called Nathan. He answered on the 4th ring. "Hey, Dad, the hospital called me." There was a pause. "About the bill?" "About the 6,800. Oh, that one little word bothered me. Not surprise, not confusion. He had been expecting the call. "They're ready to process it," I said. "Okay." I waited. When he said nothing else, I asked, "Are you still expecting me to pay it?" Another pause. "Dad, you said you would." I know what I said. "Then I don't understand the question." I rubbed my thumb along the edge of the table. The question is whether you still expect me to contribute $6,800 after what happened at the hospital. Nathan let out a slow breath. Those are two different things. Are they? Yes. Rachel was exhausted. She had just given birth. She wanted some privacy. Her parents were there. That's not the point. Her sister was there too. Dad. I recognized the tone. It was the one Nathan used when he wanted a conversation to end without actually resolving anything. I kept my voice level. I'm not saying Rachel didn't have the right to decide who stayed in that room. Then what are you saying? I'm saying I drove 13 hours because you asked me to come. Then I was told only real family could stay. Now, 4 days later, the hospital is calling because apparently my money is still welcome. He went quiet. I gave him several seconds. Then Nathan said, "So this is about punishing Rachel?" "No. It sounds like it. It's about understanding what you expect from me. I expect you to keep your word." That landed harder than I expected. For most of Nathan's life, keeping my word had mattered to me more than being liked. I had missed fishing trips because of emergency call-outs, worked Christmas Eve more than once, and still made sure I showed up wherever I had promised my family I would be. But a promise made inside one relationship could not be separated forever from how that relationship actually worked. So I asked him the question I had been avoiding. If I don't pay the $6,800, am I still welcome to meet Miles? Nathan didn't answer. I waited. Nathan, why are you making this transactional? I'm asking you whether it already is. That's ridiculous. Then answer me. He sighed. Rachel is upset. That isn't an answer. She needs time. Would she need less time if I paid? Dad, come on. There it was. Not yes, not no. Just enough fog to keep me reaching for my wallet and hoping it would clear. I closed my eyes. When you're ready to tell me I can meet Miles because I'm his grandfather, call me. Dad, I'm not buying permission. You're twisting this. No, I'm finally asking what the terms are. I ended the call before anger could turn the conversation into something uglier. Then I called the billing office. The same woman answered after I gave my information. I'm withdrawing my authorization for that payment, I said. She verified my identity and confirmed that my card would not be charged. I asked one more question. This doesn't interfere with Rachel's insurance or her account, correct? No, sir. You're only withdrawing your voluntary payment. Thank you. When I hung up, I expected relief. Instead, I felt sick. The money was still mine, but Miles was still hundreds of miles away. I thought withdrawing the money would end the argument. Instead, Nathan showed me what seeing Miles was going to cost. The silence after I withdrew the payment lasted less than 24 hours. Nathan called the next afternoon, and I could tell from his first word that anger had gotten him nowhere. Dad. His voice was softer than it had been the day before. I was in the workshop beside the cradle I had finally carried in from the SUV that morning. What is it, Nathan? I've been thinking. That was not an apology, but it was closer than anything I had heard since the hospital. He said the birth had been more emotional than anyone expected. Rachel had been exhausted. He had been overwhelmed. Everybody had been running on nerves and very little sleep. I think things got blown out of proportion, he said. Which things? A pause. Everything. He wanted peace without naming who had done what. Still, I let him continue. Look, Dad, I don't want this to become some permanent family war. Neither do I. You're my father. For the first time since I had left Tampa, something inside me loosened. Then he said the words I had been hoping to hear. I want you to meet Miles. I sat down on the old stool beside my workbench. When? We'll figure something out. I'm serious, he said. I don't want you thinking we're trying to keep you away from him. If Nathan was trying to repair things, I was willing to meet him halfway. I appreciate you saying that. Rachel's still pretty upset. I figured. She thinks you withdrawing the hospital payment was meant to embarrass her. There was nobody watching me do it. You know what I mean? She feels like you made a promise, then took it back because your feelings got hurt. I leaned forward. I withdrew money I had volunteered after I was told I wasn't welcome. I know, Dad. He sounded tired rather than angry, and that made it harder to stay guarded. Then he said, I think if you put the payment back the way it was, Rachel would probably calm down. I stared at the cradle beside my workbench. And then I can meet Miles? Nathan hesitated. I'm saying things would be easier. That isn't what I asked. He said nothing. I could hear Miles crying faintly behind him, and for one dangerous second I imagined making a single call, restoring the payment, and driving south again. Nathan knew how badly I wanted to hold that child. So I meet him after I pay? I asked. Silence. Nathan! That's not what I said. Then tell me I'm wrong. He couldn't. I stood up. If you want me to meet Miles, invite me to meet Miles. Don't attach a bill to the invitation. Dad, you're making this harder than it needs to be. No. I'm finally making it clear. We ended the call without shouting. That almost made it worse. I stayed in the workshop after the call, pretending to straighten tools that were already in order. The cradle sat a few feet away, finished and waiting for a child who had no idea any of this was happening. I hated that something made with so much care had become tied to a family argument before Miles had even spent a week in the world. A little after 6, my phone buzzed. Not Nathan. Rachel. It was the first direct message she had sent me since the birth. This is exactly why I didn't want you there. I read it 3 times. My first reaction was anger. My second was confusion. She had not written, "This is why I don't want you around now." She had written, "Why I didn't want you there." The resentment had existed before I walked into that hospital. Before the billing call, before I withdrew $1, I typed several responses and deleted them all. Finally, I sent nothing. For the first time, I stopped asking myself what I had done in Tampa. I started wondering what Rachel believed I had done before I ever left Kentucky. That night, Rachel's mother asked me why I had changed my mind about coming to the hospital. Janet's message came in just after 8 that evening. "Ray, I've been meaning to ask you something. Why did you change your mind about coming to the hospital?" I stared at the screen long enough for it to dim. Then I tapped it awake and read the sentence again. "Changed my mind?" I typed slowly. "Janet, I didn't change my mind. I was there." The 3 little dots appeared almost immediately, then disappeared, then came back. "You were?" I called her before the conversation could become a trail of confused text messages. She answered on the second ring. "Ray? I was at the hospital," I said. "The day Miles was born." There was silence. "I don't understand. I arrived that afternoon. You came all the way down?" "Yes, but Nathan said." She stopped herself. I sat back in my chair. "What did Nathan say?" Janet hesitated, and I could hear Frank speaking somewhere in the background. "He told us you probably weren't going to make the trip." I felt a small pressure start behind my eyes. "When?" "A few days before the induction." "That doesn't make sense." "I know." I told her exactly what had happened, but I kept it simple. I did not repeat Rachel's words with more bitterness than necessary, and I did not try to turn Janet against her own daughter. I told her Nathan had invited me. I told her he had texted during the drive. I told her I reached the postpartum floor and left when I was asked to give them space. Janet sounded stunned. "Ray, I thought you decided not to come." "Why?" "Because that's what we were told." The wording bothered me. "Way, not I, not Rachel. We were told." Did Rachel know Nathan had said that? I don't know. That answer was important. Janet was not protecting Rachel. She genuinely did not know. A minute later, my phone buzzed against my ear. "I just sent you something," she said. I opened the message. It was a screenshot from a family group chat. There were several names I recognized from Rachel's side of the family. Nathan's message sat in the middle. "Dad probably won't make the trip. Hospitals really aren't his thing, and it's a long drive. Don't worry about planning around him." I read it once, then again. Hospitals really aren't his thing. I almost laughed. I had spent enough time in hospitals to last 3 lifetimes. I had sat beside Pat through surgeries, treatments, long nights, and finally the morning I went home without her. Nathan knew that. More important, I had already told him I was coming. "What day was this?" I asked. Janet gave me the date. I opened my own messages with Nathan. It took less than a minute to find it. Same evening, Nathan had written, "Drive safe, Dad. Let me know when you get close." I put the 2 messages side by side on my screen. One son, one day, 2 stories. My stomach tightened. "Janet, did Nathan ever tell you I'd already started the drive?" "No." "Did he tell you he'd asked me to come?" Another pause. "No." I thanked her for sending the screenshot. Before we hung up, Janet said quietly, "Ray, I'm sorry. I honestly thought you stayed home." "I believe you." And I did. That was the unsettling part. For the first time, I had something that did not depend on memory, tone, or interpretation. I had Nathan's words. I stood up and walked into the kitchen. The house was dark except for the light over the stove. I thought about the hospital again, but differently this time. Nathan had known I was driving toward Tampa. At the same time, he had prepared Rachel's family to expect that I probably would not come. That did not prove he had planned what happened. I was not ready to accuse my son of something that serious. But it did prove he had seen two versions of the same day developing and chosen not to correct either one. Maybe he expected me to turn around. Maybe he assumed Rachel would tolerate me once I arrived. Maybe he simply wanted to avoid one uncomfortable conversation and hoped everybody else would sort it out. That last possibility felt painfully familiar. Nathan had always hated disappointing people directly. As a boy, he would tell me he had finished homework when what he really meant was that he planned to finish it later. As a teenager, he once told Pat I had already agreed to let him stay out past midnight, then told me Pat thought it was fine. At the time, we had laughed about it. Kids try things, but Nathan was 37 now. I returned to the kitchen table and scrolled farther back through my messages. I wasn't sure what I was searching for. Maybe another contradiction. Maybe proof that this was all a misunderstanding. Instead, I found a message from Rachel from nearly 6 months earlier. It had arrived after an argument about the house she and Nathan wanted to buy. I remembered her being angry, but at the time I assumed the problem was simply that I had refused to contribute as much as they wanted. Her message read, "Don't make another promise you won't keep." I stared at it. Another promise? I could remember saying no. I could remember explaining why. I could remember offering something smaller and more practical. But I could not remember promising Rachel anything. And suddenly that old message looked very different. For 6 months, Rachel had been angry about a promise I couldn't remember making. Rachel's message stayed on my screen long after I stopped scrolling. Don't make another promise you won't keep. 6 months earlier, I had read that sentence as anger. Now I read it as evidence. The house had been Nathan's idea at first, or at least that was how he presented it to me. He called one Saturday morning and said he and Rachel had found a place outside Tampa with 4 bedrooms, a fenced yard, and enough space for a nursery and a home office. We're trying to think long-term, he told me. I understood that. A baby changes the way you look at square footage. Then he told me the price. I asked what their monthly payment would be after taxes, insurance, and everything else. Nathan gave me a number that sounded too optimistic. What happens if Rachel takes more time off than planned? I asked. We'll manage. What happens if the insurance goes up? Dad, what about childcare? We've run the numbers. I could hear irritation building in his voice, but I had spent most of my adult life looking for the point where a system failed under pressure. It was a hard habit to turn off. Then Nathan finally got to the reason for the call. If we put more down, the monthly payment gets easier. How much more? He hesitated. About $50,000. I knew immediately what he was asking. You want me to provide it? Help us with it. Those words were always softer. Help. I asked him how much they had saved themselves. He told me. I asked what Rachel's parents were contributing. He told me that too. Then I took a breath. Nathan, I don't think you can afford this house. You haven't even seen it. I don't need to see the kitchen countertops to understand the mortgage. That's what you always do. What? Turn everything into a spreadsheet. I should have stopped there. I should have said no clearly, respectfully, and left the rest alone. Instead, I became the supervisor again. If you need somebody else's $50,000 just to get through the front door, you can't afford the house. The silence afterward told me exactly how the sentence sounded. Nathan? Yeah. I'm not saying you shouldn't buy a home. Sure sounds like it. I'm saying not this one. He gave a short laugh without humor. Right, because you know what's best. That irritated me, and I let the irritation show. I know what happens when people build a life around the best-case scenario. The conversation ended badly, not with yelling. Nathan and I rarely yelled. We were better at ending conversations before either of us admitted how angry we were. An hour later, I felt guilty. Pat used to tell me I could turn advice into a judgment without realizing it. You solve the problem so fast, she once said. People think you stopped listening before they finished speaking. She had been right often enough that I had learned to recognize the sting of it after she was gone. So I texted Nathan. I told him I was not willing to contribute $50,000 toward that particular house. But I also told him that if they chose something less expensive, I would consider helping with a reasonable portion of the closing costs. If the house needed electrical repairs, I would come down and do what I legally could myself or help them find someone reliable. Nathan replied, I'll talk to Rachel. That was the last real conversation I remembered having about the money. At least, that was what I thought. Now, sitting at my kitchen table, I began comparing dates. Rachel's message about another promise had arrived 3 days before Nathan first asked me for $50,000. I checked it again because I assumed I had made a mistake. I hadn't. Her message was dated Tuesday. Nathan's call asking for the money had been Friday morning. I knew because I had written the house figures on the back of an old utility envelope and dated it out of habit. 3 days. That was impossible if Rachel's anger had started with my refusal, unless she believed the promise already existed. I searched farther back. There was another message from Rachel from the week before. Thanks again for helping us make this work. It means a lot. At the time, I had assumed she was talking about the baby in general. I had already offered to help with some nursery furniture and part of the medical costs. Now the wording made me uneasy. Make this work. I opened my messages with Nathan from that same week. Nothing about $50,000. Nothing about a down payment. Nothing about me promising them anything. The first mention came on Friday. Nathan had asked me for money Rachel already seemed to believe I had agreed to provide. I sat there staring at the dates until the truth became too obvious to keep avoiding. Someone had told Rachel I had already said yes, and unless there was another conversation I had somehow forgotten, that someone could only have been Nathan. I thought back to how cold Rachel had become after the house fell through. The short replies, the way she stopped asking whether I wanted to visit, the tension at holidays. I had assumed she disliked being told no. That explanation had been convenient because it allowed me to dismiss her resentment as entitlement. Now I had to consider something harder. Maybe she believed I had betrayed her. Maybe Nathan had made a promise in my name and left me standing in the wreckage when I refused to honor it. Rachel wasn't angry because I refused $50,000. She was angry because Nathan had already told her it was hers. I called Nathan the next morning. By then I had checked the dates enough times to know I wasn't relying on memory. Rachel had believed the $50,000 was promised before Nathan ever asked me for it. There was only one person who could explain how that happened. He answered, sounding tired. Dad, can this wait? Miles was up half the night. No. That got his attention. What's wrong? I need you to answer something. He sighed. Okay. When did you tell Rachel I had agreed to give you $50,000 for the house? The line went silent. Not completely. I could hear movement somewhere behind him, a cabinet closing, then the faint sound of water running. What are you talking about? I'm talking about dates. Dad, I never told her you guaranteed anything. That isn't what I asked. Another pause. I probably told her you'd help. Probably? You've helped before. That doesn't turn my money into a promise. His voice hardened. Why are we dragging this up now? Because Rachel was thanking me for help 3 days before you ever asked me for $50,000. That stopped him. For several seconds, Nathan said nothing. Then I heard Rachel in the background. What is he talking about? Nathan lowered his voice. Nothing. I'll call you back, Dad. Before he could hang up, I said, Rachel, you should probably hear this. There was another silence. Then her voice came closer. Hear what? Nathan muttered something I couldn't make out. Rachel said, put it on speaker. I heard the soft change in sound when he did. I repeated the question. Rachel, before Nathan asked me for $50,000, did you believe I had already agreed to give it to you? She answered immediately. Yes. Nathan cut in. That's not what I said. Rachel ignored him. You told me your dad was putting in 50. I said he probably would. No, you didn't. Rachel, you said 50,000. There are moments when a family argument becomes so quiet that the silence feels louder than shouting. This was one of them. I asked, do you remember when he told you? Rachel gave me the approximate day. It matched. I looked at the date on my legal pad. That was before Nathan asked me. What? I heard about the 50,000 for the first time on Friday morning. Nathan said, Dad, come on. We'd talked about helping us with the house. No, we talked about you looking for a house. Those are not the same thing. Rachel's voice changed. Not angry now, uncertain. Nathan told me you had already said yes. Nathan started explaining that he had assumed I would help because I had helped him before. He said he had been optimistic. He said he had never meant to make a formal promise on my behalf. Each explanation seemed to make Rachel quieter. I opened my phone. There's something else. What? She asked. After Nathan asked me and I said no to that house, I sent him a message. Nathan spoke quickly. Dad, that doesn't matter. I think it does. I read it aloud. I reminded Nathan that I would not put $50,000 into a house I believed stretched their budget too far. Then I read the part where I offered to help with a reasonable portion of closing costs if they chose something less expensive. I also mentioned my offer to help with electrical work. Rachel said nothing. I asked, did you ever see that message? No. Nathan? He didn't answer. Rachel asked him directly. Did he send you that? Yes. And you never showed me? I was going to explain it. When? Rachel, we were already upset. That's not an answer. I could hear something in her voice I had not heard at the hospital. Not contempt. What? She said. You told me your dad changed his mind. Nathan tried to interrupt. Rachel continued. You said he got cold feet when he saw the price and decided we couldn't handle it. I was trying to simplify things. You made me think he broke a promise. I didn't make you think anything. Yes, you did. I almost stepped into the argument out of habit. For years, when Nathan got into trouble, I became the man who organized the facts, explained what had gone wrong, and proposed the solution. This time I stayed quiet. Nathan needed to answer his wife himself. Eventually, Rachel spoke to me. Ray? Yes. I need to ask you something directly. Go ahead. Did you ever promise Nathan $50,000 before he talked to you that Friday? No. Not approximately. Not verbally. Nothing? Nothing. She breathed out slowly. And after you said no, you offered to help us with a cheaper house? Yes, Nathan said. This is getting twisted. Rachel replied, No, I think it was twisted before. That sentence stayed with me. There was no apology between Rachel and me that morning. We were nowhere near that point. Too much had happened. But before the call ended, she said, From now on, if you say something about me, I want to hear it from you. That works both ways, I said. Fine, Nathan protested. You two are acting like I'm some kind of liar. Neither of us answered him. For the first time, Rachel and I had compared the same event without my son standing between us to interpret it. And the story had changed. The $50,000 was the first lie Rachel and I could both prove, but it wasn't the first story Nathan had changed. Rachel called me the next afternoon. I almost let it ring, not because I didn't want to hear from her, but because after the conversation about the $50,000, I wasn't sure what kind of call this would be. An apology seemed unlikely. Another argument seemed more realistic. I answered anyway. Rai? Yes? I think we need to talk without Nathan. That was the first sentence she had ever said to me that felt completely direct. All right. She was quiet for a moment. I believed you thought we were irresponsible. I leaned back in my chair. Because of the house? Because of a lot of things. I waited. Rachel said Nathan had told her I thought the house was ridiculous, that she was pushing him into a lifestyle he couldn't afford, and that I was tired of cleaning up after both of them. I never said you were pushing him. You said the house was too expensive. I did. And you said he couldn't afford it. I said they couldn't afford it. That's not much better. She was right about that. I had spent years believing that if the numbers supported me, the way I delivered them didn't matter. I could have said it better, I admitted. Rachel did not answer. I was talking about the mortgage, I continued. But I made it sound like I was judging the two of you. I can see that now. You always sound like you're evaluating us. That landed harder than I expected. What do you mean? You ask questions like you're interviewing someone for a job. Income, insurance, childcare, backup plan, emergency fund. I was trying to help. I know. Her answer surprised me. Then she added, But sometimes help from you feels like a test Nathan has to pass. For a moment I could almost hear Pat. She had said nearly the same thing in a different way. Sometimes Nathan needs a father, not a foreman. I rubbed my forehead. That part may be on me. Rachel breathed out slowly. I'm not saying Nathan should have lied. Good. He shouldn't have. That matters. It does. Her voice softened slightly. But when he told me you thought I was pushing him into that house, I believed him because it sounded like something you might say. That was painful because it contained more truth than I wanted. I understand. But now I'm wondering what else he changed. There was a long pause. Then I asked the question that had been sitting in the back of my mind since Janet sent me that screenshot. Rachel, did you know I was coming to the hospital? She did not answer immediately. I knew you wanted to come. That isn't what I asked. Another silence. Finally, she said, I told Nathan I didn't want visitors right away. When? The night before your induction. My grip tightened around the phone. Before I left Kentucky? Yes. I stood up without realizing it. What exactly did you tell him? That I wanted my parents and my sister there at first. I told him I wasn't ready to deal with anybody else. Anybody else? You. At least she said it plainly. And what did Nathan say? He said he'd handle it. I walked to the kitchen window. Outside, everything looked ordinary. A neighbor was rolling a trash can toward the curb. A pickup passed at the end of the street. Inside my head, the hospital was happening all over again. Nathan knew. Before sunrise, before I pulled out of my driveway, before I crossed into Tennessee, before every one of those messages asking how far out I was. He knew Rachel did not want me there, yet he had texted me anyway. "Drive safe, Dad. Let me know when you get close." I had assumed Nathan froze when Rachel saw me. Now I knew the collision had been visible before I ever started the engine. "Why didn't he tell me?" I asked. Rachel's answer came quietly. "I thought he did. That hurt more than anger would have." I said, "He kept encouraging me to come." "What?" "He texted me all day." Rachel said nothing. "He told me when Miles was born. He gave me the floor. He knew exactly where I was." "That doesn't make sense." "No." For once, Rachel and I agreed completely. She sounded shaken. "I thought you showed up because Nathan couldn't get you to understand. He never asked me not to come." "I didn't know that." "I'm starting to believe there's quite a lot neither of us knew." Rachel was silent for several seconds. Then she said, "I still shouldn't have said what I said at the hospital." It was not yet an apology, but it was the first time she had acknowledged that the words themselves mattered. I didn't push. Instead, I asked, "Why were you so determined not to have me there?" Her answer came slowly. "It wasn't just you." "What was it?" She exhaled. "That house was supposed to be a reset for us." I frowned. "A reset from what?" The line went quiet again. This time, when Rachel spoke, there was no anger in her voice. Only exhaustion. "Nathan and I almost didn't make it to the pregnancy together." I stood there, staring out the window. I had thought the house was about money. I had thought the hospital was about resentment. Now I understood there was something underneath both of them that nobody had told me. I asked her what they needed to reset from, and for the first time she told me their marriage had nearly ended. Rachel did not tell me everything that afternoon. She told me enough to change the shape of the story. "It was about 5 weeks," she said. 5 weeks? That's how long we were separated. I sat back down at the kitchen table. The previous fall, Nathan had rented a furnished apartment on the other side of Tampa and moved out of the house. Rachel stayed behind. They did not file for divorce, and according to her, neither of them knew whether the separation would become permanent. I tried to place those weeks in my own memory. Then I realized something that bothered me. Nathan had called me during that time, more than once. One Saturday, he asked whether I thought his truck needed new brakes before winter. Another evening, we talked for 20 minutes about a college football game. He called on Pat's birthday because he knew that date was difficult for me. Not once had he said he was living somewhere else. Not once had he said his marriage was in trouble. I remembered asking casually, "How's Rachel?" His answer had been the same kind of answer he always gave. "She's fine." Now I wondered what fine had meant. "Where was he living?" I asked. "A furnished apartment near his office, and he never mentioned it to me." Rachel gave a tired little laugh. "I assumed you knew." "No. He told me he'd talk to you." That sentence immediately put me on alert. Talk to me about what? About us having problems. He didn't. Rachel went quiet. I could almost hear her recalculating another piece of the past. "What happened?" I asked. "Between us?" "Yes." She hesitated. "We weren't getting along." "That covers a lot of ground." "I know." I waited, but she did not elaborate. There had been a time when I would have kept asking until I got an answer. Years of supervising crews had trained me to dislike missing information. If a breaker tripped, I wanted to know what overloaded the circuit, not simply reset it and walk away. But Rachel was not one of my crews. Neither was Nathan. So I said, "You don't have to tell me something you're not ready to tell me." Her voice softened. "Thank you." That told me the details mattered. It also told me pushing would only close the door. Later that evening, Janet called about something completely unrelated. She wanted to know whether I had received the photograph she had sent of Miles sleeping with one fist tucked beneath his cheek. We talked about the baby for a few minutes. Then I asked carefully, "Janet, did you know Nathan and Rachel separated last fall?" "Of course." Her answer was so immediate that I almost laughed. "I didn't." There was a pause. "Oh, you thought I knew too?" "I certainly did." "How long were they apart?" 5 weeks, maybe a little more. Rachel was staying at the house. Nathan rented some place near work. Exactly what Rachel had told me. Janet continued, "Frank and I tried to stay out of it. They're adults." I appreciated that sentence more than she knew. "Did you think they were getting divorced?" "For a while, yes." That surprised me. Rachel had said the marriage nearly ended. Janet made it sound even closer. "What changed?" "I don't know everything," she said. "One day Rachel said they were trying again. They started counseling for a while, and Nathan moved back. Then they started looking at houses." "Yes." Janet sounded almost amused. "Rachel became obsessed with that place." I remembered the glossy listing Nathan had sent me. 4 bedrooms, big kitchen, perfect yard. I had looked at it and seen numbers. Mortgage, taxes, insurance, maintenance. Rachel had looked at it and seen something else. A house where the separation had never happened. A nursery that belonged to a marriage beginning again instead of one barely recovering. A place without the rooms where they had argued. For the first time, I understood why my refusal of the $50,000 had landed so hard. It did not make Nathan's lie acceptable. It did not make Rachel's treatment of me at the hospital acceptable, but it made her anger more human. She had not believed I was merely rejecting a house. She had believed I had first promised to help them build a new beginning, then pulled it away. And Nathan had allowed her to believe that because telling her the truth would have meant admitting he had promised money that was never his to promise. The next morning, Rachel called again. I told her Janet had confirmed the separation. Rachel sounded uncomfortable. I wish she hadn't gotten involved. She didn't, I asked. Oh, I let a few seconds pass. Rachel, I'm not asking what happened during those 5 weeks. Good. But Nathan told you he'd discussed the separation with me. Yes, he didn't. A long silence followed. Then, Rachel said, almost to herself, so he was pretending everything was normal with you. That's what it looks like. He did that with my parents too. Not everything, just enough. There was something behind her words, something she still was not ready to explain. I did not chase it. By then I thought I understood the secret. Nathan and Rachel had nearly lost their marriage, hidden it from me, reconciled, and tried to build a new life before the baby arrived. That was complicated enough. I thought their hidden separation was the secret. Then Rachel discovered Nathan had hidden something from her about me too. The picture arrived just before noon. There was no explanation, no request, no argument attached to it. Just Miles asleep in a pale blue sleeper, one hand curled beside his face. For several seconds, I did nothing but look at him. Then I realized something else. Rachel had sent it. Not Nathan. It was the first time since Miles was born that she had reached out without money, blame, or some disagreement sitting between us. I typed, "He's getting bigger already." A minute later, she replied, "He eats like he has somewhere to be." I laughed before I could stop myself. For a moment, we sounded almost normal. I had missed ordinary conversation more than I realized. A baby should have given us dozens of harmless things to talk about: sleep, bottles, expressions, tiny socks that disappeared in the laundry. Instead, every exchange so far had carried the weight of whatever Nathan had told one of us about the other. Then she wrote, "Did you really drive all the way down with something for him?" I knew what she meant. "The cradle," I replied. "I brought an old cradle Nathan used as a baby." Her answer came immediately. "What cradle?" I stared at the screen. I had assumed Nathan told her. I had talked to him about it more than once. When I pulled it down from the rafters, I sent him a picture of the cracked rail. Later, I sent another after I finished sanding and refinishing it. Nathan knew exactly what I was bringing. Rachel knew nothing. I called her. "What do you mean, what cradle? I mean, I've never heard about one." "It was Nathan's. When he was a baby?" "Yes." I walked into the workshop as we spoke. The cradle sat beside my bench under a clean white sheet. I pulled the sheet away. "Pat kept it for 37 years, I said. "I spent weeks restoring it for Miles." "You brought it to Tampa?" "It was in the back of my SUV." Rachel went quiet. I ran my hand along the top rail. The finish caught the afternoon light, and for a second I remembered Pat standing beside that same cradle when Nathan was small enough to fit inside it. "I figured I'd bring it to your house when you were ready." Nathan never told me. There was something different about that silence. It was no longer two people waiting for the other to become defensive. It was two people discovering the same missing piece. Rachel finally said, "I thought you didn't get him anything." "I didn't buy the cradle." "That's not what I meant." "I know." She sounded embarrassed. "Nathan said you were being cautious, that you didn't want to overdo things." I was trying not to interfere, but the cradle mattered. "Why?" I looked at the faint pencil initials Pat had written beneath the frame decades earlier. "Because his grandmother saved it before she ever knew who would sleep in it next." Rachel was quiet again. "I wish I'd known." "So do I." I could have used the moment to score a point. I could have told her Nathan had made sure she saw the least generous version of me, but I still did not know how deliberate any of this had been. So I said only, "I'm starting to think there's a lot he didn't tell either of us." 2 evenings later, Rachel called me on video. She said Miles had finally settled and thought I might like to see him awake. I watched him stare at the screen with the grave expression newborns sometimes have. "He looks serious," I said. "He gets that from Nathan." For once, we both laughed. Rachel was sitting in the living room. Behind her, on a side table, was a bouquet of white flowers. A small card leaned against the vase. From where she sat, I could make out only one thing. A. My eyes stayed on it a fraction too long. Rachel noticed. She reached behind her and turned the card face down. I said nothing. There were plenty of innocent explanations. A coworker, a neighbor, a friend whose name happened to begin with E. By then, I had learned something important. Not every unanswered question deserved an immediate accusation. Miles started fussing. Rachel shifted him against her shoulder. "He's tired," she said. "I should let you go." She nodded. Then, almost absent-mindedly, she said, "Things will be easier once we know." I frowned. "Know what?" Her expression changed. "Nothing." "Rachel?" She looked away from the camera. For several seconds, the only sound was Miles breathing against her shoulder. Then she said, "We agreed to wait." "For what?" She closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, I could see she regretted saying anything. Then Rachel said 6 words she clearly wished she could take back. "We agreed to wait for the test." For the rest of that evening, 6 words kept circling in my head. We agreed to wait for the test. Rachel had ended the video call almost immediately afterward. "Forget I said that," she told me. Then she claimed Miles was getting fussy and needed to be fed. Maybe he did, but I had spent nearly 40 years supervising people who sometimes realized halfway through a sentence that they had revealed more than they intended. Rachel's face had changed before Miles made a sound. Still, my first thought was not anything dramatic. Newborns have tests. There are blood screenings, hearing tests, follow-up appointments, and things I probably knew nothing about. I had not raised a baby in 37 years. Maybe Miles had a health concern they had chosen not to discuss with me. That possibility worried me far more than whatever family argument we were having. I picked up my phone twice that night, intending to ask whether Miles was all right. Both times I put it down. If something was wrong with the baby, Nathan and Rachel had the right to decide when to tell me. The trouble was that Rachel had not said, "We're waiting for his results." She had said, "We agreed to wait for the test." There was a difference. By the next morning, other details had begun returning to me. Nathan and Rachel had been separated for 5 weeks. The flowers behind Rachel during our video call had carried a card signed only with the letter E. And then there was Nathan's reaction in the hospital when I said Miles had Pat's chin. At the time, I had assumed I caught him at a bad moment. "Dad, he was born a few hours ago. Nobody can tell who he looks like yet." Nothing about any one of those things proved anything. That mattered to me. I had spent my working life watching people make expensive mistakes because they decided on an answer first and then collected only the facts that supported it. I was not going to do that to my own family. Maybe E was a coworker. Maybe the test was medical. Maybe Nathan had snapped at me because his wife had just given birth and he was exhausted. So instead of inventing a theory, I decided to ask the one person who should have been able to give me a straight answer. "Nathan," he answered around lunchtime. "Hey, Dad, do you have a minute?" "Depends. On what?" "Whether this is another interrogation." I ignored that. "What test did you and Rachel agree to wait for?" Silence. Then he said, "What?" "You heard me. Where did you get that?" "Rachel mentioned it." He exhaled sharply. Rachel shouldn't have said anything. That answer eliminated one possibility immediately. If the phrase meant nothing important, he would have told me I misunderstood. Instead, he was upset that Rachel had mentioned it. "What kind of test is it?" "It's private." "Is Miles sick?" Nathan answered quickly. "No." Relief hit me first. Whatever else was happening, Miles was apparently healthy. "All right," I said. "Then what is it?" "Dad, leave it alone." "I'm trying to." "No, you're not. I asked whether the baby was sick. You said no. Now I'm asking why both you and Rachel are acting like 3 ordinary words are classified information. It's between me and my wife." That irritated me. Not because married people should not have privacy. They absolutely should. But Nathan had spent the past week using family relationships when they were useful and hiding behind privacy when questions became uncomfortable. I kept my voice calm. "Then tell me it has nothing to do with me." "It doesn't." "Fine." I almost ended the call. Then I remembered the hospital. Only real family stays. The flowers, the separation, Nathan's reaction to the resemblance comment. I did not want to say the question. Part of me already understood that once it was spoken aloud, there would be no putting it back. "Nathan." "What?" Does the test have something to do with Miles? He did not answer. At first I thought the call had dropped. Nathan. Still nothing. I pulled the phone away from my ear and checked the screen. Connected. Nathan. Are you there? Yes. His voice sounded different. Lower. Tighter. I waited for him to say no. One syllable would have ended everything my imagination had begun assembling. Instead he said, Dad, I told you it's private. My stomach tightened. I stood and walked toward the kitchen window without knowing why. Outside, a delivery truck stopped 2 houses down. Someone's dog barked behind a fence. Life went on as if my son had not just changed the meaning of half a dozen conversations by refusing to answer one simple question. I could have pushed him. I could have said Rachel's name, asked about the separation, demanded to know who E was. I didn't. Whatever truth Nathan was protecting, I wanted him to choose to tell it. I'm not going to accuse anybody of anything, I said. But when you're ready to tell me what's happening, tell me the truth the first time. He said nothing. I ended the call. For the rest of the afternoon, I tried to stay busy in the workshop. But every time I looked at the cradle, the same silence came back to me. When I said Miles's name, my son went silent long enough for me to know the answer mattered. Nathan called the next evening. He did not begin with hello. Dad, can I come by tomorrow? His voice sounded tired in a way I had never heard before. You don't have to drive all the way up here just because I asked a question. I know. Then why are you coming? Another pause. Because you deserve an answer. That sentence stayed with me until he arrived the following afternoon. Nathan parked beside my truck and sat behind the wheel for almost a minute before getting out. When he finally walked into the kitchen, he looked older than 37. I poured coffee for both of us. He never touched his. For several seconds, he stared at the cup. Then he said, The test is a paternity test. I had expected something close to that after our last call, but hearing the words still tightened my chest. I did not speak. Nathan rubbed both hands over his face. Rachel and I were separated last fall. I know. His head came up. She told you? Yes. He nodded slowly. During those 5 weeks, she saw somebody. The person who sent the flowers? Nathan looked surprised. What flowers? Never mind. He stared at me for a moment, then looked down again. His name is Evan. They dated before Rachel and I met. The letter on the card made sense now. Nathan continued. It happened once. At least that's what she told me. There was bitterness in his voice, but not the kind I expected. You believe her? Yes. That answer came quickly. She told me herself after we got back together. I didn't catch her. Nobody called me. She sat me down and told me. That mattered. Rachel had made mistakes, but she had not hidden this one from her husband. What did you do? I almost left again. He gave a humorless laugh. Actually, I packed a bag. Then I sat in my car for an hour and came back inside. Why? Because I still loved her. He looked toward the window, and because I wasn't exactly innocent in what happened to the marriage before that. I did not ask what he meant. This was not the moment to open another door. A few weeks after we decided to try again, he said, Rachel found out she was pregnant. I felt the rest of the sentence before he said it. The timing overlapped. Yes, you could be the father. Yes, and Evan could be. Nathan closed his eyes. Yes. The room became very quiet. Then he said something I was not prepared for. I decided I was staying. I looked at him, even without knowing, especially then. His eyes were wet. I'd already seen the first ultrasound. I'd heard the heartbeat. I was there when she got sick in the grocery store. I painted that stupid nursery twice because she hated the first color. For the first time since the hospital, I saw my son as something other than the man who had hurt me. He was frightened. He had been frightened for months. I told Rachel we'd deal with the test after the baby was born, he said. I didn't want the whole pregnancy to become a countdown to some result. That part, I understood. What I did not understand came next. I leaned forward. When did you know there was a possibility? Nathan's face changed. Dad. When? Before Christmas. I stared at him. Months before Miles was born. You knew before I drove to Florida. Yes. The answer came quietly. You knew when you kept texting me on the road. Yes. I felt anger rise, but I kept my voice controlled. You knew when Rachel looked at me and said only real family could stay. Nathan swallowed. Yes. That one hurt differently now. Not because Miles might not share my blood, because Nathan had stood there carrying this secret while letting those words land on me. And when you told me to leave? Yes. I stood and walked to the kitchen counter. Nathan said, Dad, the baby was still my son to me. I didn't ask whether you loved him. I do. I believe you. He looked almost relieved. Then I turned around. But you used him against me. His relief disappeared. What? You told me to think about what kind of relationship I wanted with my grandson. I was angry. You knew there was a chance he wasn't biologically yours, and you still used the word grandson because you knew exactly what it would do to me. That wasn't how I was thinking. Maybe not, but it was what you did. Nathan stared at the table. I asked, has the test already been done? He nodded. Samples were collected a few days ago. Yours and Miles's? Yes. When do you get the results? They said soon. I sat down again. Neither of us spoke for a while. I did not know what I wanted the answer to be. For Nathan's sake, I wanted Miles to be his. For Miles's sake, I wanted every adult around him to stop turning uncertainty into fear. Nathan finally stood to leave. At the door he said, whatever the result says, I love that boy. I believed him. That was what made everything more painful. A few days later, Nathan arrived at my door carrying a white envelope and said, Dad, Miles isn't mine. I stepped aside and let Nathan in. He walked to the kitchen table without waiting for me to tell him where to sit and placed the white envelope between us like it contained something dangerous. Only days earlier, we had sat in those same chairs talking about a possibility. Now the possibility had become a result. You're sure? Nathan nodded. They said the results exclude me as the biological father. Biological father. That distinction mattered, even in a moment like this. A private test could tell Nathan something about biology. It did not magically decide every legal or parental question waiting beyond my kitchen. But none of that was what my son was thinking about. He stared at the table. I knew it was possible. I know. I kept telling myself the odds were still on my side. I said nothing. Then his face tightened. I changed diapers. I was there when he came home. I barely slept for days because every sound he made scared me. His voice broke. And now a piece of paper says he's not mine. There was no satisfaction in seeing Nathan like that. None. For all the anger I carried, he was still my son. I had watched him break an arm at 11, lose his first job at 23, and stand beside me at Pat's funeral trying to act stronger than he was. This pain was different. I moved the envelope aside and said, a lab result doesn't erase what you felt for him. Nathan looked at me. I don't even know what I'm supposed to feel. You don't have to decide that today. He nodded, but then I saw the familiar shift. Fear turning into logistics. What am I going to tell people? That's between you and Rachel. Dad, please don't tell Janet or Frank. I wasn't planning to, or anybody. I said I wasn't planning to. He leaned forward. If they ask you, can you just say the test hasn't come back yet? I looked at him. No. His expression hardened immediately. Why not? Because protecting your privacy and lying for you are not the same thing. He pushed back from the table. You know what I mean. Yes, I do. Nathan rubbed his hands together. We need time. Then take time. Rachel's a mess. I imagine she is. And I don't know what this means legally. Then you need proper advice. He looked at me again. That look, I had seen it since he was a teenager. Dad will know what to do. Dad will call someone. Dad will make the problem smaller. I may need an attorney, he said. Then talk to one. They're not cheap. I let the silence answer first. Nathan stared at me. You're serious? Yes. Dad, this is not me asking for money for a vacation. I know. This could get complicated. I know that too. He looked offended that I was not moving faster. Then he said, at least put the hospital payment back. I almost laughed, but there was nothing funny about it. What does the DNA result have to do with the hospital payment? Everything is piling up at once. That doesn't make it my bill. You said you would help. We already had that conversation. This is different now. There it was again. Every crisis became an exception. Every exception became another reason I was supposed to step in. I looked at my son and, for the first time, saw the pattern clearly enough that I could not pretend it was temporary. When Nathan hurt, I fixed. When Nathan panicked, I paid. When Nathan created a mess, I helped him explain why it was not entirely his fault. Then, once the emergency passed, he resented me for knowing too much about how it had been cleaned up. Pat had seen it years before I did. Nathan lowered his voice. I just need help. I know. Then help me. I am sitting here with you. That's not what I mean. I know that too. His jaw tightened. So what? You're going to make some point now. No, it feels like it. I'm not going to announce that result to anyone. I'm not going to shame you. I'm not going to tell you what you should feel about Miles. He looked away. But I'm also not going to lie, pay every new expense, or make every call because this hurts. You think I caused this? No. That surprised him. Rachel told you the truth about Evan. You chose to stay. Biology isn't a punishment. His shoulders loosened slightly. But what you do next is still your responsibility. Nathan sat there for a long time. Then he asked the question I had somehow known was coming. Can I stay here for a while? I looked past him toward the hallway, toward the spare room he had slept in so many times over the years. Then Nathan asked if he could move back home, and for the first time in 37 years, I knew love required a different answer. I looked at Nathan for a long moment before answering. You can stay tonight. Relief moved across his face so quickly that I almost hated what I had to say next. One night, I added. Not until things settle down. Not until you figure everything out. Tonight. His expression changed. Dad, I don't know where I'm supposed to go. You have an apartment in Tampa. I can't go back there right now. Then get a hotel tomorrow. Stay with a friend. Make whatever arrangement makes sense. Nathan stared at me as if I had spoken in another language. You have 3 bedrooms. I know how many bedrooms I have. So what difference does it make? The old answer formed automatically in my head. No difference at all. That was how it had always started, a few nights after a breakup. Alone until the next paycheck. A car repair he would repay later. A temporary problem that became mine because I could solve it faster. I had called it helping. Nathan had learned to call it normal. You need somewhere safe to sleep tonight, I said. You have it. Tomorrow, you start making decisions. He shook his head. This is unbelievable. I did not argue. That evening, I made sandwiches because neither of us had much appetite. Nathan barely touched his. He spent most of the night walking between the kitchen and living room, checking his phone every few minutes. Rachel called twice. He let both calls go unanswered. You should probably talk to her, I said. I don't even know what to say. That doesn't mean you shouldn't answer. He looked at me. You want me to call her now? No. That surprised him. You just said. I said you should talk to your wife. I didn't say I was going to tell you when, how, or what to say. Nathan gave me a tired, irritated look. You're really committed to this new thing, aren't you? What new thing? Acting like nothing is your problem. I felt that one. I went into the kitchen and rinsed my plate. Behind me, Nathan said, I need to call the hospital tomorrow. I need to figure out the bill. I need to find an attorney. I don't even know where to start. You just named 3 places to start. He laughed bitterly. That's helpful. It's more helpful than me doing all 3 for you. You know people. So do you. You know how to handle this kind of stuff. No, Nathan. I know how to make phone calls. He stood up. You don't understand what this feels like. No, I don't. His eyes narrowed, maybe because he expected me to argue. I turned to face him. I don't know what it feels like to learn the child you thought was biologically yours isn't. I'm not going to pretend I do. His shoulders dropped slightly. But being in pain doesn't mean you stop being responsible for your next decision. There it is. What? The lesson. I almost snapped back. Instead, I heard Pat's voice in my memory. She had said it after Nathan lost his first serious job in his 20s. I had been ready to call someone I knew and line up another position before Nathan had even updated his resume. Pat had stopped me in the hallway. Helping him isn't the same as saving him from every consequence. At the time, I told her I was only opening a door. She said, then make sure he's the one who walks through it. I had forgotten that part. Or maybe I had chosen to. Nathan looked at me now with the same expression he used as a boy when he believed I could fix something and simply refused. So this is when you decide to teach me independence? He asked. No. Sure feels like it. I'm deciding not to confuse being your father with being your emergency department. His face hardened. Nice. I'm still here. Are you? Yes. Because from where I'm standing, the first time I actually need you, you're telling me to get a hotel. There was enough truth in the accusation to make me hesitate. My spare room was 10 steps away. I could tell him to stay a week. Then 2. I could call the billing office in the morning. I could search for attorneys. I could contact Rachel and tell her Nathan needed space. I knew exactly how to take over. For several seconds, I almost did. Then I thought about every other crisis I had made easier for him, and every resentment that followed. No, I said quietly. The first time you actually need me, I'm sitting here, I'm listening. I'm giving you a safe place tonight. I'm just not becoming responsible for your whole life tomorrow. Nathan looked away. The next morning, I heard him in the kitchen before I got out of bed. He was on the phone with the hospital. Later, he searched for family law attorneys himself. I did not ask what they told him. Just before noon, he packed his bag. At the door, he said, I don't know if I agree with what you're doing. You don't have to. He left without hugging me. 2 hours later, Rachel called. Her voice was unusually controlled. "Ray, Nathan told me he stayed with you. One night, I figured." Then she paused. "There's something he never told you about the morning after Miles was born." My hand tightened around the phone. "What?" "He told me you were already gone. I had spent months wondering why Nathan never called me back to the hospital." Rachel was about to tell me that she had tried. Rachel did not rush to explain. For several seconds, I heard only her breathing on the other end of the line. Then she said, "The morning after Miles was born, I asked Nathan if you were still in Tampa." I closed my eyes. "I was. I know that now." "What did he tell you? That you'd already left?" My hand tightened around the phone. Rachel continued carefully, as if she understood that every sentence was changing something I had carried for months. "I felt bad about how things happened." "You felt bad?" "I was angry with you, Ray. I'm not pretending I wasn't, and I meant it when I said I wanted space." She paused, but by the next morning, I knew what I said was cruel. Only real family stays. I had replayed those words enough times that I could still hear the exact tone. Rachel said, "I told Nathan that if you were still nearby, maybe you could come for a few minutes before you drove home." I walked slowly toward the kitchen table and sat down. What time was this? Early, maybe 8:30. I remembered that morning clearly. The cheap motel coffee, my suitcase already packed, my phone lying beside me while I waited for Nathan to answer. I texted him. Rachel went silent. "At around 8, I said. I told him I was staying until 10. I said if you felt up to it, I'd like 5 minutes with Miles before I left." "Oh my God." He never answered. "I never knew you sent that, and I never knew you asked for me." Neither of us spoke for a while. That was the moment the hospital stopped looking like one bad family argument. Nathan had stood between two people who were both willing, however awkwardly, to repair something. Rachel had asked if I was still there. I had told Nathan I was still there. He gave each of us a version in which the other person had closed the door. "Why would he do that?" Rachel asked. "I don't know." But for the first time, I was no longer sure avoidance was enough to explain it. Rachel said, "There are other things." I felt my stomach tighten. "What things?" "Things Nathan told me you said." I waited. "He told me you said I cared more about appearances than about building a stable family." I frowned. "I never said that." "You said something about the house being about image." "No. I said the house looked good on paper, but the payment didn't." Rachel was quiet. "He told me you called me controlling." "I didn't. He said you thought I was pushing him into having a baby before he was ready." That one stopped me. "I never said that either." "You sure?" "Yes." I stood again, suddenly too restless to sit. "I did tell Nathan once that becoming a parent makes financial problems harder, not easier." That was after he complained about money. "But you never said I was pushing him?" "No." Rachel let out a breath that sounded almost like a laugh, except there was nothing amused in it. "He made it sound like you blame me for everything." I leaned against the counter. "And what did he tell you?" I thought after the separation. Another long pause. "That's complicated." "Rachel." "He said you told him he should think very carefully before tying himself to someone who created chaos in his life." I stared at the wall. "I never knew you were separated." She said nothing, so I couldn't possibly have said that about the separation. No. For the first time, there was no defensiveness between us. Only the uncomfortable realization that we had both spent years reacting to conversations that might never have happened. I thought about every holiday where Rachel had seemed guarded before I even walked through the door. Every phone call where I had assumed her silence meant contempt. Every time Nathan told me, "Rachel thinks you're interfering." Maybe some of it was true. Rachel and I were very different people. We had genuinely irritated each other. I had been too blunt. She had been too quick to assume judgment. But now another possibility stood beside all of that. Nathan might not have simply softened disagreements. He might have sharpened them. "Did he tell you things I said often?" Rachel asked. "Enough." "Like what?" I almost started listing them. Then I stopped. "Not yet." I wanted to know exactly what belonged to Rachel and what belonged to Nathan before I accused either of them. "I think we need to compare some things," I said. Rachel's voice lowered. "I think so too, but not over the phone forever." "No." "And not through Nathan." "Definitely not." That answer came quickly. After we hung up, I sat alone in the kitchen and looked back through years of messages with my son. Nothing in them suddenly transformed into proof, but the pattern had become visible enough that I could no longer ignore it. For years, I thought Rachel and I simply disliked each other. The truth was uglier. Someone had been making sure we did. Rachel and I did not need years of messages to prove what Nathan had been doing. 3 examples were enough. I called him that evening and asked him to come over. He arrived looking guarded. "Is Rachel coming?" "No." That seemed to relax him. It should not have. We sat at the kitchen table. I had my phone beside me, but no folder, no stack of evidence. I did not want this to feel like a trial. I wanted to hear whether my son could finally tell me the truth without being cornered into it. I began with the house. "I told you the mortgage was too high." Nathan nodded. "What did you tell Rachel?" His eyes moved toward the window. "I don't remember exactly." "She remembers." "Dad, you told her I thought she was pushing you into a lifestyle you couldn't afford." Nathan rubbed his jaw. "That was basically what you meant." "No, it wasn't. It was close. Close is the problem." He looked irritated. I moved to the second example. "Rachel once told you I talked to you like a child." Nathan's expression changed. "What did you tell me?" He did not answer. "You told me she said I was trying to control your marriage. That's how it felt. To you?" He leaned back. "You're splitting hairs." "No. I'm separating what people said from what you needed them to mean." That landed. The third example was the one I cared about most. "You told Rachel I blamed her for pushing you into having a baby." Nathan stared at me. "I never said that. You talked about whether we were financially ready." "I talked about you. You knew I'd understand who you meant." "No, Nathan. You knew how to make her understand what you needed her to hear." He stood abruptly. "So what is this? You and Rachel compare notes and decide I'm the villain now. Sit down. I'm 37 years old. Then act like it." The words came out sharper than I intended. Nathan froze. For a second, I hated myself for sounding exactly like the father he had accused me of being. I lowered my voice. "That was unfair." He looked surprised. "I'm trying not to do what I always do with you, but I need an answer." Nathan remained standing. "Why did you keep changing what we said?" "I didn't change everything. I didn't say everything." He stared at the floor. "I softened things. You sharpened them. Sometimes." "Why?" He said nothing. I waited. Years ago, I would have filled the silence with my own explanation. I would have told him what I thought his problem was, and then demanded he agree. This time I waited until he had nowhere to hide except behind his own words. Finally he sat down. "Because it was easier." "For whom?" "For me." That was the first completely honest answer. Nathan clasped his hands together. "When Rachel was angry at you, she wasn't asking why I hadn't saved more money. She wasn't asking why I'd promised something before I talked to you. I said nothing. And when you were frustrated with Rachel, you weren't asking why I couldn't keep my own house in order." The bitterness in his voice surprised me. "You thought I saw your marriage as something you had to keep in order? You see everything that way." Maybe I did. Nathan looked at me. "That's the part you never understood. Every time something went wrong, you came in and knew what to do. The car, the job, money, mom getting sick. You always had a plan." "I didn't always have a plan." "You looked like you did." His eyes reddened, "and standing next to you made me feel like the man who never did." There it was, not hatred, shame. Nathan continued. "I wanted your help. I just didn't want the part where you knew I needed it." I thought about every time he had called me during a crisis and resented my questions afterward. Dad's help without Dad's authority. "And Rachel?" I asked. "I wanted her to believe I had things handled." "So you made me the reason they weren't handled." "Sometimes. And you made her the reason I couldn't reach you." Nathan's face tightened. "Yes." He sought back. "Why make us dislike each other?" He looked directly at me then. "Because when you two were angry at each other, neither of you was looking at me." The sentence seemed to remove all the air from the room. Suddenly, the last several years made a terrible kind of sense. The house, the hospital, the way Nathan always appeared trapped between us while somehow escaping responsibility himself. I asked the question I had been saving. The morning after Miles was born, Rachel asked if I was still nearby. Nathan looked away. "I know. And I texted you that I was at the motel." "I know. You told her I'd left." "Yes." "You ignored my message." "Yes." "Why?" His answer took longer. "At first, because I didn't want another argument." "At first?" Nathan swallowed. "Then I thought about it." "About what?" His voice dropped. "You've spent my whole life deciding when I was making a mistake. What I should buy, what job I should take, what I should have done differently. That doesn't answer me. Part of me wanted you to know what it felt like when someone else decided you didn't get a say." I stared at my son. Rachel had regretted what she said. I had been 10 miles away. One phone call could have changed that morning. Nathan had deliberately chosen not to make it. I did not yell. There was nothing left to uncover by shouting. You were angry with me, I said. So instead of telling me, you used your wife and your newborn son to punish me. Nathan closed his eyes. I know how it sounds. It sounds like what happened. The next day, Nathan had to sit at one table with every person whose version of the truth he had controlled. The meeting took place at Janet and Frank's house because nobody wanted to pretend my kitchen or Nathan and Rachel's home was neutral ground anymore. Nathan sat beside Rachel at the dining table, though there was nearly a foot of space between their chairs. Janet and Frank sat across from them. I took the end seat. Nobody touched the coffee Janet had made. Frank finally said, "We're here because too many people have been told too many different versions of the same things." Nathan stared at his hands. Janet looked at him. "Did your father come to the hospital when Miles was born?" "Yes." "Did he drive 13 hours?" "Yes." "Did he choose not to visit?" Nathan swallowed. "No." Janet's mouth tightened. I did not need her anger on my behalf, but I understood it. She asked the next question. "Did Ray ever promise you $50,000 for that house?" "No." Rachel closed her eyes briefly. Nathan continued before anyone asked. "I told Rachel he would help before I actually asked him." "And when he refused?" Frank said. "I told her Dad changed his mind." Nobody spoke. There was one question I still needed answered in front of Rachel. "Nathan, after I withdrew the hospital payment, did Rachel ever tell you I couldn't see Miles unless I paid?" Rachel turned toward him. Nathan's face changed. "No." Rachel stared at him. "What?" Nathan rubbed both palms against his knees. "You were angry about the money. That isn't what Ray asked." "No." My heartbeat quickened. "Did Rachel tell you to make my relationship with Miles depend on that payment?" "No." Rachel's expression hardened. "Then where did that come from?" Nathan looked down. "Me." The word landed quietly. That made it worse. I thought if Dad put the money back, things would calm down. Rachel stared at him. "You told him I was keeping Miles away because he wouldn't pay?" "I said you were upset. You made it sound like I put a price on my own child." Nathan had finally reached the place he had spent years avoiding. There was nobody left to blame sideways. Janet reached for her phone. "Nathan, you told this family your father probably wouldn't come to the hospital." He nodded. "You let everyone believe he stayed home." "Yes." "Then fix it." Nathan looked at her. "What?" "The group chat." His face flushed. "Mom, is that necessary?" "Yes," Janet said. "Because the lie was public to this family. The correction should be too." Nathan unlocked his phone. Nobody dictated the message. That mattered. After several minutes, he turned the screen toward us. "My father drove 13 hours to be there when Miles was born. He did come to the hospital. I let people believe he chose not to, and that wasn't true. Dad also never promised us $50,000 for the house. I'm sorry I put him in the middle of things I should have handled myself." Janet read it once. "Send it." Nathan did. I expected to feel triumphant. Instead, I felt something quieter. Relief. My name no longer depended on Nathan's version of me. Frank leaned forward. "Now about the money." Nathan looked uncomfortable. "We're working something out." "Good," Frank said. Rachel looked at her father. "You're not going to help?" "We already have," Janet answered. "What we're not going to do is become the next people who solve every problem for you." For once, nobody looked at me to see whether I would step in. Nathan and Rachel arranged a payment plan for the hospital balance. The larger house disappeared from their plans. Nathan rented a modest apartment while they decided whether their marriage could survive everything that had happened. The questions about Miles's biological father were theirs to handle properly. I stayed out of them. A few weeks later, Rachel called. "There's something else." "What?" "The cradle." I looked across my workshop at it. "Do you want it back?" she asked. I understood what she meant. Miles did not carry Dawson blood. Maybe she expected that fact to erase what the cradle represented. "No." She was silent. "Keep it." "Ray, I built it for a baby. Miles didn't lie to me." Rachel started crying quietly. I did not tell her everything was forgiven. It wasn't. But forgiveness and innocence were different things, and Miles had never wronged me. The months that followed were surprisingly full. A retired electrician I had worked with for years asked me to join a volunteer group that repaired small electrical problems and safety hazards in homes belonging to older people who could not afford contractors. I said yes. My workshop became a workshop again. Instead of a room where I stared at an unused cradle, I met old friends for breakfast. I stopped checking my phone every hour to see whether Nathan needed something. When he called, we talked. Sometimes I helped. Sometimes I simply listened. The difference was that neither of us confused the two anymore. Near Miles's first birthday, An envelope arrived. Inside was a small invitation. No request for money. No list of gifts. At the bottom, Rachel had written, "We hope you'll come." No strings attached. I drove to Tampa again. Not because Nathan needed me. Not because Rachel owed me anything. Not because I was afraid that saying no would cost me a place in Miles's life. I went because I wanted to. The first time I drove 13 hours to Tampa, I thought family was something other people could let me into or shut me out of. I know better now. Blood can tell you where you came from. Money can tell you who paid. Neither one tells you who will tell the truth when the truth costs something. Rachel once told me only real family stays. She was right about one thing. She just didn't understand what made a family real. On the drive home, I found myself thinking less about what had happened to us and more about what I would do differently from then on. Family should never be measured by who pays the bills, who shares the same blood, or who can be pressured into proving their love. I spent years believing that being a good father meant stepping in whenever my son struggled, but I finally understood that rescuing an adult from every consequence can keep him from learning how to stand on his own. Love needs compassion, but it also needs boundaries. If someone repeatedly lies, manipulates your words, or makes affection conditional on money, do not keep rewarding that behavior just because they are family. Ask direct questions. Speak to people for yourself instead of trusting a third person to carry every message. Keep important promises and financial arrangements clear, especially when large sums of money are involved. At the same time, do not let anger turn you into the kind of person who punishes innocent people for someone else's mistakes. Miles had done nothing wrong, and refusing to hurt him became as important to me as refusing to be used by the adults around him. I learned that forgiveness does not mean pretending nothing happened, and setting a boundary does not mean you stopped loving someone. Sometimes the healthiest thing you can do for a family is stop covering up the consequences that might finally teach everyone to change. In the end, dignity is not something your relatives are allowed to give you or take away. It begins with deciding that love will never again require you to abandon your self-respect.